it's noon time, so I think we'll get going. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our virtual gathering presented by the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance, the statewide membership-based historic preservation organization. My name is Beverly Thomas, and on behalf of the Preservation Alliance, I'm pleased to welcome you to Exterior Paint Colors for Your Old House with Leigh Schoberth. Today's program is part of our Old House and Barn Expo on the Road series we launched in March as our COVID-safe replacement of our postponed 2020 Expo. We'll continue to offer these virtual sessions throughout the year, and we'll soon be announcing some in-person events later in the summer and the fall as well. We always enjoy getting you and other old house and barn owners together to share practical information from highly qualified presenters, make connections, and offer you a dose of energy and inspiration too. I know many of you have joined us at past Expo on the Road sessions, but for those who have not, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping points before we get started. I ask that you please stay muted to keep the background noise to a minimum during the presentation. You may want to spotlight the speaker by choosing side-by-side speaker option under the view feature, and also turn your videos off to keep the internet connection as strong as possible. Today's presentation will run about 45 minutes and will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A. I'll wrap up the program by 1 o'clock, but Leigh has agreed to stay on until 1:15 for those of you who have additional questions. Leigh has asked that we hold the questions till the Q&A period, but we do encourage you to use the chat function for questions during the presentation. We'll do our best to answer them during the Q&A time. And before we close, we'll select a lucky winner of today's Expo door prize. And now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker. Leigh Schoberth joined Historic New England in 2020 as the Senior Preservation Services Manager. Leigh identifies key issues impacting historic preservation and develops public programs and other outreach activities. She manages the Homeowner Services Program, which offers personalized support to older house owners, answering questions ranging from historic paint colors to energy efficiency. And she connects with homeowners through her work overseeing Historic New England's easement properties as well. This is Leigh's second presentation for our Old House and Barn Expo series on the road, and we're pleased to have her back. So at this point, I'll turn it over to you, Leigh. Thank you for joining us today.
Great, thank you, Beverly. So I just want to say thank you to Beverly and the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance for inviting me to speak about exterior paint colors as part of the Expo on the Road. And thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. Some of you may know Historic New England from visiting one of our historic sites in the region. As part of its mission, Historic New England saves and shares historic homes, open space, collections, and stories from the past to today. And through our work, we also hope to inspire good preservation practices beyond our sites and across the region. So as Beverly said, within the organization, I am part of our preservation services team, which builds partnerships between Historic New England and preservation-minded organizations like New Hampshire Preservation Alliance, with the shared goal of protecting historic properties throughout the region. The Preservation Services team does this through Preservation Easement Program, our homeowner services, advocating for historic resources, and providing educational opportunities like today's lecture. So the question for all of us today is, with thousands of color options, how do you choose a color to paint your house? Maybe white with dark shutters? Overwhelmed by thousands of options, it can be a safe default, but I hope by the end of today's lecture, we can all feel a bit more confident stepping into the world of color and how it can enhance the character of your house. Many assume that paint color choices are all about what colors you like, but it's more than just a personal choice. We will look at several color selection options or approaches for old houses, how color choices related to available colors at the time and the accompanying architectural styles. Then we'll finish with a few very practical recommendations in preparation for painting day. So our color selection approaches. Historian and author Roger Moss identifies three main approaches of historically informed color selection for old houses: the scientific, the boutique, the historical approach. We're going to take a quick look at the scientific and boutique approaches, but we'll spend most of our time looking at the historical approach today. The intent of the scientific approach is to determine as precisely as possible the historical colors and application sequence on a historic building. This approach is standard for museums and other landmark buildings, where determining the original and subsequent period colors is important to interpretation of the building for the public. This is achieved through two methods: finish exposures and sample collection. Finish exposures are performed by carefully removing layers mechanically and/or by chemical strippers. This technique is best for uncovering hidden artwork or decorative patterns beneath layers of overpaint. Historical research, photographs, and other documents assist with the identification of potential areas for exposures in a building. And some of you may be more familiar with collecting samples. So a scalpel, a micro drill are used to cut through the layers of paint, here seen in this image here, down to the substrate, which this is whatever material the paint was first applied to. It's typically plaster or wood. So macroscopic examination, as shown on the right here, is completed in situ to describe as many physical features as possible. This includes color, size, texture, and general conditions. For a closer look, samples are prepared in the lab for microscopic examination using a stereo microscope, as seen in the image on the left. Microscopic examination can also help determine original colors, subsequent painting schemes, and help distinguish between primers, glazes, and other types of decorative finishes. Understanding the paint composition, its pigments, binders, and solvents used in certain layers may be needed for more accurate analysis. So a polarizing light microscope or a chemical analysis can be used to identify the composition of paint. So this is Beauport, one of historic New England's properties, also known as the Sleeper McCann House in Gloucester, Massachusetts. Beauport was the summer home of one of America's first professional interior designers, Henry David Sleeper. It was built in 1907. This photo is how Beauport looks today. Its shingles painted a dark chocolate brown, the original color based on research and physical evidence. But paint is not a stable material. It often undergoes radical changes, especially when exposed to UV. So if you had visited Beauport a little over a decade ago, its color scheme would have looked a bit different. You would have seen a faded reddish brown color. So UV exposure had faded the dark brown color to a reddish brown, similar to the shade found on the interior known as Beauport Aubergine. So during a painting campaign in the late 1990s, Beauport had been color matched and painted Beauport Aubergine. But during more recent repair work, the shingle on the right was found. It was protected from the UV by an alteration completed in the 19-teens, suggesting that this dark chocolate brown was close to the original, if not the original color. Then additional research had uncovered past paint analysis results that aligned with the color found on the shingle. So uncovering an original color at a historic site can be transformative and important to its interpretation. So a combination of physical evidence and paint analysis brought Beauport from aubergine to chocolate brown. So our second approach, the boutique approach, originated in San Francisco starting in the early 1960s. About 48,000 houses in San Francisco were constructed in Queen Anne and other Victorian styles between 1849 and 1915. While some neighborhoods were destroyed during the 1906 earthquake and fire, many examples survived in the western and southern neighborhoods. During the World War, many of these Victorian era homes were painted war surplus battleship gray paint. But in 1963, San Francisco artist Butch Cardam began painting the exterior of his Italianate style home with shades of blue and green. Following suit, other neighbors began experimenting with vivid, strong contrasting colors for their own homes too. They utilized a polychrome treatment of colors including blues, purples, yellow, greens, and reds. The best known examples of this movement are the Painted Ladies, these 7 Queen Anne style homes on Steiner Street in San Francisco. By the 1970s, the colorist movement, as it had become called, had spread across the nation. Although a range of colors was available during the Victorian era, these vibrant color choices do not reflect historical colors that would have been available at the time of their construction. Victorian colors were very muted in comparison to this boutique or painted ladies approach. Then while paint analysis can provide the original color, composition, and application information, the expense of such analysis can be impractical for the average homeowner. The historical approach provides homeowners with the ability to select colors that, while not necessarily original to the house, are appropriate for the architectural style and date of construction. The historical approach is based on paint application practices and colors that were historically available. Before the Civil War, house painting was a craft more akin to plumbing, electrical, and fine carpentry than the DIY task many of us see it as today. So painting required a knowledgeable practitioner because raw materials were mixed on site. It was not a manufactured product. Early hand-mixed paints were comprised of 3 basic parts: pigments, binders, and solvents, but they varied widely in color and quality depending on the ingredient sources and the quantities they were mixed. So here we have our elaborately dressed painters with their aprons, their fancy hats, painting different components of the buildings with their selected color and their special brushes. Some of you may be familiar with the Boston stone, a 2-foot diameter round granite millstone embedded into the foundation of a building that's not too far off the Freedom Trail route. There is no signage or interpretation except for the engraved plinth stone below. There are a number of theories around the Boston stone, whether it's the center of Boston and or a landmark location, but we're going to focus on the history related to the hand grinding of paint pigments. So the site was the location of the first recorded paint mill in the United States. It was owned by Thomas Child. Child had served his apprenticeship with the London Painter and Stainer Guild, and he arrived in Boston in about 1685. So Child is said to have imported the millstone used to grind the paint pigments from England around 1700. When he died just 6 years later, the stone was apparently lost until it was discovered in 1836 when the paint mill was demolished for the construction of the existing building. So historically, the number of paint colors available was fewer. Pigments were derived from natural and organic sources. And the first synthetic organic dye was discovered in 1856. So houses constructed for the 1860s and 70s were usually painted with pigments derived from natural sources like carbon or oxide-containing clays. So yellow ochre is from oxide-containing clay. It was used to create cream and straw and ochre colors. Red iron oxide is also sourced from clay. It was used in the popular but inexpensive barn reds or Spanish brown colors. And then bone black was derived from a form of charcoal produced by burning animal bones and was used to create shades of gray. Other organic pigments such as red cochineal from the cochineal beetle, blue from the indigo plant, or verdigris from copper patina were more expensive and not color fast, so they were less widely used on exterior paint colors, while whitewash, which is a mixture of slaked quicklime and water, was the cheapest and probably the most common exterior coating for buildings before the 1860s. Colored illustrations and publications and primary resources from painters are rare in the 17th and 18th century. So our understanding of paint colors from this period is largely derived from the physical evidence, with a few hints from inventories and account books. One of the earliest examples of a paint palette was architect Andrew Jackson Downing's hand-colored plate found in his book, Cottage Residences, published in 1842. Jackson wrote, "As it is difficult to convey in words a proper ideal of delicate shades of color, and as we think the subject of very great impertinence in domestic architecture, we have given specimens." So the palette illustrated suitable tints for painting houses, and we'll look at Downing's recommendations later applied to an Italianate style house. So let's take a look at some of the color selections for our early architectural styles that would have used these hand mixed paints. So an important step when you're starting to look at your paint colors through the historical approach is understanding the architectural style of your house. There are numerous online architectural style guides available, but arguably the most comprehensive guide for residential architecture is Virginia McAllister's A Field Guide to American Houses. The drawings and diagrams help navigate some of the finer details between styles, and many houses have evolved over time through alterations and additions. So if you find that your house has had significant changes after its construction, McAllister's Field Guide can help you determine the new primary style that your house embodies today and help inform your color selection. Historical research shows that most houses were painted using 3 separate colors to define the 3 major architectural elements: your body, trim, and sash. Body is all of the siding or shingles, and trim is all other woodwork. So this includes window trim, cornice details, porch railings, everything that is not the body. Then the sash color, we want to think about anything that moves. So your window sash, your storm windows, your shutters, and your doors. Although color choices can affect first impressions, color placement can be the real key to a successful paint campaign. But the sash color does not always follow these rules. Through the 18th century into the early 19th century, the sash matched the trim, typically off-white. Beginning with the Greek Revival architecture, the sash matched trim colors, typically a dark green or black. To help visualize color trends across the architectural styles, I've included paint chips from Historic New England's Historic Colors of America paint palette and guide. The palette includes 149 colors selected from samples, or includes 100 from samples from historic buildings and painted objects. Now let's dive into our examples from the pre-Civil War era. The earliest bidders to settle in the Massachusetts Bay Colony brought with them the English post-medieval building techniques. The first period houses reflect British Gothic and medieval architecture adapted to the New England climate. Most first period houses have been enlarged or modified, but those that retain their identifiable features include steeply pitched roofs, usually a side gable, narrow overhang eaves with almost no cornice detail, a massive chimney either in the center location, here, small multi-paned windows, either a casement or fixed, and then the batten vertical board and door. So also from the colonial era, the Georgian style arrived in the English colonies via British pattern books. The style was derived from the English interpretations of the 16th century Italian Renaissance architecture. Expressions of Georgian architecture in the United States can range from simple vernacular to more elaborate ornamented styles. Typically, features include a symmetrical 5-base facade. So we're seeing those 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't think my laser pointer is wanting to work here. So we'll just, there it goes. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then we also see the multi-pane double hung windows. Here we see a 12/12. We have a side gabled roof, this decorative cornice details, and then a pedimented, not a pediment, a crown and pilaster door surround. Sometimes it could include a pediment. So notable scholar Abbott Lowell Cummings states that there is little evidence that first period houses were stained or painted. Paint analysis suggests that occasionally trim elements of a house were painted a dark red brown using our red iron oxide. The majority of rural houses remained unpainted on the exterior through much of the 18th century. While in the urban settings, we start to see more painting, at least at the for wealthy owners, houses were painted. Prior to the Revolutionary War, exterior paint tended to favor contrasting color schemes with trim almost always in white. But 18th century white was composed of linseed oil and white lead, and many include calcium carbonate for a softer off-white to yellow shade, very different from the kind of true modern titanium white that we would think of today. So Arnold House on top is located in Lincoln, Rhode Island. It was restored to its 1692 appearance. This is a first period house. It's been left unpainted. The only element of color is the harled chimney. The harling is a finish of slaked lime and coarse aggregate, which is giving the chimney its white color. At Codman Estate in Lincoln, Massachusetts, constructed in circa 1740, in the Georgian style, we see that high contrast white trim with the dark shutters. We'll just take a look. So you have this is kind of the body colors, that stone color, and then we have that dark kind of almost black for the shutters here. So despite the fight for independence, Americans remained influenced by British architecture, and the federal style was particularly influenced by British architects Robert and James Adams and archaeological discoveries like Pompeii that expanded the understanding of classical architecture. Federal style reflects a refinement in the classically inspired Georgian vocabulary. In general, the federal style shifted away from the robust Georgian vocabulary towards a lighter and more decorative expression. So in this style, we're still seeing the kind of symmetrical form here. So we still have our 5 bays, like in the Georgian period. We have this decorative cornice detail. We have an elaborate door surround. You're seeing a little bit different detail than in the Georgian, especially with this elliptical fan light is a new feature with the federal houses. And then we're still having those double hung windows, but we're seeing more 6/6 and larger glass panes as our glass technology improves. So the lighter expression of the federal detailing was also evident in the shift of exterior paint colors to lighter shades. At Historic New England's Phillips House in Salem, Massachusetts, you see the light stone color on the body. And then we have a contrasting white trim, but in many cases, the use of a single color on the body and trim was common during the federal period. And then we also have our dark shutters and doors. So our classically inspired architectural styles continued into the 19th century with the Greek Revival style. Inspired by the classical Greek temple, the style became an expression of democracy, an ancient Greek invention. Of the styles that gained popularity before the Civil War, Greek Revival was the most prolific. It was used for everything from churches to government buildings to office buildings and homes. The style spread primarily through architectural instruction pattern books, with plates showing elevations, details, and plans. So the style is characterized by, sorry, freezing here again. Let me just turn this off. I'm just going to switch to the regular cursor because my laser pointer doesn't seem to want to work. So we're seeing these kind of partial entry porches or a full width porches supported by prominent columns. And then on the door here, you can see these narrow side lights with the transom, and this is kind of incorporated into the door surround. So a little bit different than we were seeing with the Federal and Georgian there. And then we have our low pitched gable or hipped roof. And then our cornice detail is emphasized by wide or divided bands. You see here at the top roof line, but then also again on the porch here. So in early February 1842, English novelist Charles Dickens arrived in Worcester, Massachusetts. He later wrote, "All the buildings look as if they had been painted that morning. Every house is the whitest of white, every Venetian blind the greenest of green." As implied by Dickens' quote, "The most common paint scheme for Greek revival houses was white." White, a reference to the marble of the Greek temples, with the green shutters and doors and a black sash. So a side note, as we talked about earlier, some pigments were unstable and not color fast. Many pigments fade, but greens tended to darken over time. So it's possible that our dark green or black shutters actually began as a shade closer to the grass green here on the bottom, as suggested by the Dickens quote. So after the 1830s, no one architectural style would dominate residential construction. Architectural guides and pattern books promoted various styles. The Romantic Revival styles like Italianate provided a higher degree of freedom to make more decisions about design than the rigid styles that dominated the century before. So the Italianate style borrowed design elements from the villas of Tuscany. And the telling features of the Italianate style are these low-pitched roofs. Usually they're 2 or 3 stories. Also these tall, narrow windows with the decorative, either arched or a decorative crown molding above them. They also sometimes have a square cupola or tower, and then really these wide overhanging eaves with those decorative brackets. So again, few major innovations occurred in the paint industry prior to the Civil War. So despite shifts away from the more formal architectural styles, available paint colors remained much the same. But we are seeing the kind of dark, bold shades of the Georgian period joining the lighter shades of the Federal and Greek styles in the color palette here. However, while monochromatic schemes were used in Federal and Greek Revival architecture, trim was always differentiated from the body in Italianate. Andrew Jackson Downing, a promoter of the Italianate style, also articulated his color philosophy. So we saw his paint palette earlier in the lecture. He urged naturalistic colors to integrate the building into their natural environment. He never wanted to see white for the body or the trim. So we're kind of shifting away from that Greek Revival pure marble white color here with the Italianate. So the image here is a plate from the Philadelphia architect John Riddle's book, Architectural Designs for Model Country Residences. So we see the soft natural colors that were promoted by Downing with the trim the same color as the body, but there's several shades lighter. So here we're seeing this kind of stone gray, almost kind of with some tan undertones. And then we're seeing the trim in this lighter, couple shades lighter, similar colors, kind of those yellows and tans. And an alternative is the reverse. So you could have a light body with a darker trim color. We also see in this image a third color on the sash. Here it is shown in kind of a straw yellow. It's generally, the trend was towards dark green to black sash, but in this image we're seeing that kind of lighter yellow color. So now we're shifting into our kind of post-Civil War. So the first ready mix paints became available about 1870s. They were earlier efforts to develop ready mixed paints, but because of the problems with container size, shelf life, inventory, and shipping, it was a slow industry to develop in the United States, and the Civil War also kind of paused this innovation here as well. So after the Civil War, paint evolves from an artisan-based craft to a mass-produced, mass-marketed product as a result of a number of technical innovations. So aside from the ready mixed paints, we have the mass production of the tin can was perfected. It provided a container which could be filled with a uniform factory-made paint product. And then secondly, the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad allows for easier shipping. So this occurred just in time for a major shift in architectural trends and a dramatic population growth in the country. So in 1856, William Perkin, an 18-year-old English chemist, had synthesized the color aniline purple from coal tar, from which a huge industry in chemically and synthetically derived dyes developed. This led to new, broader range of paint colors in this post-Civil War era. So the new color palette opened up more complex color schemes and a range of colors that previously had been unattainable. Architects and paint manufacturers began specifying rules of color theory rather than relying on personal judgment. So many articles on the subject referred to David Ramsay Hay, a painter and author of The Laws of Harmonious Coloring. He specified two approaches, harmony by analogy. We're looking at analogous colors. So we're looking at those that are next to each other on the color wheel. So that could mean our reds and purples or our reds and oranges. And so you're thinking about those colors that are analogous in the color wheel. In contrast, we have the harmony by contrast. So we're looking at colors that are across the wheel, like your reds to greens or oranges to blues. And so other advancements in color printing also encouraged and enabled the distribution of colorful brochures, posters, advertisements that could reach mass markets in support of various paint products. So that brings us to our late 19th century styles. These are universally called the Victorian Era, named for the reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901. But this era actually includes half a dozen distinctive styles, several of which we'll look at in the next few slides. So unlike some of our previous styles that were looking to a romanticized past for inspiration, the Second Empire style was modern and imitating the latest French fashions, specifically the rebuilding of Paris, which replaced the medieval alleys and structures with wide avenues and striking monumental buildings, frequently utilizing the Mansard Roof, which gives this style its more common name. The Mansard Roof, distinctive dual-pitched hip roof shape, opened up the attic into an occupiable third floor. Aside from its roof, Second Empire or Mansard style houses commonly have details very similar to those of the closely related Italianate style. So here we're seeing these brackets at the cornice, very similar to what we were seeing with the Italianate style. We're also seeing kind of the elaborate door surrounds and also around the windows as well. So some of these details are carrying over from those earlier styles. So alluding to masonry construction through color is common with Mansard style houses, as they're Parisian prototypes for stone buildings. So the stone colors of the grays, tans, ochres, and beiges of the earlier 19th century styles were again popular. With its strong similarities to Italianate, it's also appropriate to use those two shades of the same color as we were talking about on the body and trim. So dark body with a light trim or the reverse. And then thinking about color theory approaches, you can also use kind of contrasting paint colors as appropriate. Here in our example, we see kind of this dark bluish green color And then our accent or our trim color is done in maybe kind of this tan color. And then the real key component with this style is making sure those deep tones that convey the formality of this architectural style. And then we're still seeing kind of these dark shades on our sash, our shutters, if they're on the house and on the doors. So the Queen Anne style was named by and popularized in England by architect Richard Norman Shaw. The first use of the style in the United States was by Henry Hobbs Richardson in Newport in 1875. But most Americans saw examples of the style exhibited at the Philadelphia Centennial in 1876. So this style, kind of eclecticism, asymmetry, contrast, and even excess were all hallmarks of the Queen Anne style. It utilized a variety of surface textures, elaborate motifs, kind of decorated gables, and turned porch columns. So many Queen Anne style homes today are painted in that painted ladies approach, with a sprinkling of bright, vivid colors, kind of drawing out some of these decorative details. While Queen Anne style homes embrace the new colors available at the period, visual evidence from promotional materials suggests these homes were painted in one or two body colors with a unifying trim color. Then sometimes an accent color was used on the gable or a decorative banding. And then the windows continued in those dark, deep contrasting shades for the sash, the doors, and the shutters. So in our example here, we have a little bit lighter version than maybe the Victorians. They're usually kind of very muddied, deep colors. But here we're seeing this kind of soft stone gray. We've got kind of a lighter trim color, and then this kind of warmer, almost brown gray is used on kind of some of the details on that. But you'll see kind of in the middle of this color palette, this bright blue here. This was kind of one of those exceptions where we get these kind of brighter shades of blue, but this was very limited to kind of those decorative elements that Queen Anne styles often have. So the shingle style was most popular in New England seaside resorts. And although a truly American design, it borrowed liberally from other Victorian styles. So its asymmetrical forms, its porches and use of wall shingles were very similar to Queen Anne, but it shied from those kind of excess applied decorations. Its distinguishing characteristic is the natural colored shingles covering both the roof and the walls, and then these irregular, steeped roof lines with multiple eave heights. So despite today's taste for lighter colors, shingle style houses were originally stained dark shades of brown. So if the shingles have not been previously painted, continuing to stain is recommended. If the shingles have been painted, kind of keeping those natural dark brown to chocolate tones is appropriate. Deep olives, gray brown to dark green could also be considered. Trim is usually painted a neutral color that either coordinates with the body or is a little bit darker contrasting color, such as the dark green or maroon. And then again, the sash and doors is continuing those trends of dark colors. So these houses were built to blend into their natural surroundings, so the colors should reflect that. So in this example, we're seeing this kind of, maybe you would call it gray brown here. And then we have kind of this darker, couple shades darker for the trim color. And then the doors, they're using this kind of reddish brown color. So you'll see, and here on the slides in the color palette, the kind of body colors are very neutral, lots of shades of brown into those kind of maybe dark gray shades, and then a little bit more, but still a very muted color palette when you're talking about the trim, sash, door, and shutter colors. So following the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition in 1876, there was a resurgence of interest in 18th century American culture, which extended to the architectural styles. So early examples of a colonial revival used Georgian details eclectically, kind of applying similar to what we would have seen with the Queen Anne. But by the 1900s, the style followed more closely to the symmetrical, classically inspired design elements of the 18th century. So we're seeing single or paired double hung windows, usually with divided lights, kind of echoing those historical windows. Also accentuating the front door. So it could have a decorative crown, or as we're seeing here, kind of an entry porch with very slender columns. We're seeing those side lights that we saw in kind of the Federal and Greek style houses. So we're kind of pulling a lot of these different kind of historical elements from those earlier styles. And then also wooden shutters often had little incised patterns. So here we're seeing a diamond, but I've seen everything from a dog to a carriage and horses. They can get quite elaborate in their patterns and these little incisions on the shutters. And so in the same spirit that the design elements were harkening back to those earlier architectural periods, so is the color palette of the Colonial Revival houses. So the Colonial Revival style marked a return to the lighter paint colors, but this was mistakenly suggested by the faded tones of some of the surviving 18th century houses. So generally trim and sash, again, we're back to the off-white and cream that they're kind of matching with very dark to green, dark green shutters. So in our example here, we have this kind of, our stone colors are kind of soft gray to tan. We've got kind of our creamy white trim color, and then we have our darker shutter color and door color here. So paint continues to evolve even today and into the 20th century. We're seeing changes happening to paints and types of paints available. So shortages and rationing of linseed oil during World War II accelerated the research into new types of coatings. So in 1941, the Sherwin-Williams Company introduced Chemtown wall finish. It's the first commercially successful, durable waterborne interior wall paint. So the introduction also at the same time of the hand roller made the application for DIY and the water-based cleanup very easy for the homeowners to start taking on these projects themselves. So in 1941, starting in 1941, water-based has slowly been replacing the oil-based market. And while companies had been working since the 1920s to remove and find substitutes for toxins found in paints, the most noted was the banning of the use of lead in paint in 1978. Today, companies continue to make improvements for both health and environmental safety. And more recently, we see working to remove VOCs, or the volatile organic compounds found in paint. So we're continuing to make improvements to paint and reduce those toxins even today. So in the 1980s, Benjamin Moore introduced the first computer colorized analysis system. This allowed dealers to match precise pigments to customers' needs. Previously, the dealers depended on Benjamin Moore dealers depended on the Moromatic color system that had debuted in 1959. It utilized a series of charts, gradation sheets to visually match colors. So what can go wrong when you're painting? When you start painting, you may be surprised how much of your house constitutes as trim. So you want to remember that all woodwork that is not siding or shingles is considered trim. So here in this image, we see kind of at the top, this porch detail that was done in the body color. Following that 3-color system, this really should have been in this kind of lighter shade matching the columns. And also these the details at the top of the windows here, that's also should have been a trim color if we're thinking about that 3-color system. So sometimes that amount of trim color is really surprising once you start making decisions about colors on your house. So just keep that in mind, that anything that is not body, is not the siding or shingles, is considered trim. The other problem is selecting too many colors. Other than a select number of architectural styles that may utilize a second body coat or an accent color like the Queen Anne style, most utilize at most 3 colors. However, the selection of too few can also have the opposite effect and make your house look very flat and a lot of the details lost. So you just want to think about placement and then also how many colors you're choosing. Also the wrong colors. So we've been talking about the historical approach to paint color selection, not the vibrant purple that I dreamed of painting my house as a child. So most styles, they were trying to replicate the appearance of stone. They had a limited selection of pigments, or they were trying to kind of blend the building into its natural context. So vivid purples and blues don't fit into these historical patterns, but these colors were also the most unstable pigments. They would fade unevenly, so they weren't used on exteriors often. So also selecting colors that are too light, pastel tints on clapboards and shingles can make them look like vinyl. So don't be afraid to pick from that mid to lower color of the fan depth of those body colors and really leave those lighter shades for the interiors. So I think it's important to note here, the National Register of Historic Places requires a property to be at least 50 years old before it is considered potentially historically significant. So if we think about old in National Register terms, this means any building built before 1971. Well, I doubt anyone would question the significance of Gropius House, constructed in 1938. We may start questioning defining the 1960s ranch as old, but this same historical approach can be applied to the really old house, some of those, pre-1900s we were talking about today, or those houses that are just turning 50. And we also have a 20th century color paint palette, and that color usage guide provides color recommendations for houses into the 1980s. And then finally, just a few quick recommendations in preparation for painting day. I highly recommend sampling paint colors before you finalize your color choice. Taking on exterior painting can be expensive, so you want to make sure that you are satisfied with your selection first. You don't necessarily have to turn your house into a rainbow as shown here. You can purchase a foam core and about a piece about 1 foot to 2 feet wide. And using that foam core, it's nice and light. You can paint your colors on it, carry it around the house to be able to look at it under various conditions, or even look at it next to your neighbor's house colors to see how they compare. So the colors may need to be tweaked after sampling once you see them around your house and see them together on a larger scale. So it's important to take the time to do this. Before you begin painting, make sure you check if your house is located in a local historic district and if it regulates exterior colors. So it's important to consult with the Historic District Commission before finalizing color schemes, as they may have requirements or other guidelines that you need to follow. And then finally, before repainting, it's important to evaluate the existing paint surfaces, conditions, and repair deteriorated features and correcting the cause of any excess moisture. So most paint failure can be corrected by scraping loose paint by hand or sanding to a feather edge. Removing firmly adhered paint, existing paint is not recommended as it can damage the underlying wood. Then after that, it's important to wash the house with a gentle house wash. Make sure that you allow the wood to dry before painting, usually about 48 hours. Then you're ready to kind of prime and caulk as needed and start your finish coat. So paint is a protective coating for your house, but it's also more than that. It is an expression of the period, style, history, and your home's place in the community. So I hope today you can feel a little bit more confident venturing into the world of color for your house the next time that you are taking on an exterior paint job. And then finally, I always like to provide a few resources if you're interested in learning more. The majority of my lecture today was developed from a number of websites and several books, but the resources most referenced were Paint in America, The Color of Historic Paint Buildings, edited by Roger Moss, and also a field guide to American houses from Virginia McAllister, and of course, Historic New England's Historic Color Palette and Guide, which are both available online as well, if you want to take a look at those to kind of start thinking about colors. So that is it for my presentation today. So thank you, everyone, and I think we'll have plenty of time for some questions now.
Yes. Thank you so much, Leigh. So much great information there. Nobody put any questions in the chat. So I welcome you, since I think our numbers are such that we can do this. If you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and just ask the question. I will start with a couple that I thought of, and then people can chime in afterwards. Can you talk about or touch on the importance of paint quality?
Yeah, so it's really important with paints, especially for interiors, to spend the money to purchase paints that are really going to have that durability and the longevity, because paint coatings are a protective coating. They're not just a color. So it's a really important way to not only preserve your woodwork and to kind of express the details of your house, but it's an investment in the longevity and history of your house, and it's a really important maintenance step as well. So taking that, kind of making sure that you're getting paints that are going to protect, that are going to have that longevity is really important to take on. And you don't want to buy the cheap paint and it starts running because there's too much humidity in the air, or any of those types of things. So it's definitely worth the investment to get those paints that'll last, especially with the exteriors.
And then Leigh, can you touch on paints versus stain? I know there's a lot of questions with that.
Yeah. So we kind of run into that, especially with some of the older ones or some different houses that don't have paint on them. They're both an important step. These kind of paints and stains both help protect the wood. So that's really important. If you have a house like with the shingle style that had been stained before, it's still important to kind of keep that up, because even stains are providing some of that protective coatings. But it depends on what kind of look you're going for. So usually stains we see with kind of keeping that more natural wood look, where paint colors, we're kind of getting more options of colors, and also kind of away from that more natural wood look as well.
Okay, and here's a question from Michael Barron. What about painting the door a fourth color? Or is that getting into too many colors?
The thing that's great about paint is it is one of the most reversible things that you can do, but also, as I was saying with paint coatings, it's very protective. So we see a lot of times, those bright colored doors, and we have, historical evidence. There are, I don't know that it dates back to kind of, the 16th and 17th century, but we do have examples kind of from the 19th century of, the doors being in a fourth contrasting color. So I think if it's a way for you kind of put your own little personality on it, I think it's a fun way to kind of, emphasize the entry day of the door. And the thing is if the next person decides they don't like it, paint is so easy to change in the colors, and it's reversible. So I'm full support if you want to paint your door an extra color. I think it's fun when you go through neighborhoods and you've got pinks and blues and greens. So I think it's a fun way to put your own little mark on a house, even if you're trying to keep the historical colors. So.
Okay. And Rebecca asks, here's a good one. Storm windows are available in limited colors. How do you incorporate them in a color plan?
Usually if you can kind of match your trim colors or your sash colors with your storms, I know that can sometimes be a challenge that they're very limited, but usually we're seeing with the sash and sash colors and those that were kind of in those dark ranges, or we're in the creamy white. So you can kind of still keep to that historical vocabulary. I think even if you have kind of those limited colors with the storms, but you just really do want to be conscious if you're painting your sash or your trim colors, that you're keeping that color in mind. So it's also, if you're thinking about your roof colors, you know, your foundation, those aren't things that you're going to change with when you're painting, but it's something to keep in mind when you're selecting colors, that you want all of those components to complement each other. So I think it's just something to keep in mind when you are selecting your paint colors, what colors your storms are too.
So ideally though, they would match the sash color, right?
Yeah, and if you have like extra, some people have wood framed, so those you can easily paint to match, but I know some of these, you know, the aluminums and vinyls and different types of that are out there are kind of limited in colors. But ideally it would match, but if you can kind of keep that in mind when you're selecting your colors and making those decisions.
And I think you can paint if you really wanted to,
yeah,
an aluminum storm.
Yeah. Yeah, usually it's just the big thing with most things is kind of surface preparation. So kind of sanding to give it a little grit, and then making sure you have a good primer to give you a good base to apply those colors. But most things you can paint to match. So if you choose to, you can do that as well.
Okay, here's another one. How, or should bright white always be avoided?
So there's kind of two parts of that. So historically, we know that these paints were used with linseed oil, as I had mentioned, so they tended to kind of be more creamy color. The other thing is with bright white, especially when you're out in the natural sunlight, it can almost glow when it's on your house. So I would say kind of both of those factors, it's best to kind of go with your off-whites to your creams, just to kind of avoid the kind of blinding white that it can get in the natural sunlight, and but then also kind of thinking historically, it would have been those muted colors.
Okay, and Tom asks, is there a style where window sash were in alternate color to the trim? So yes.
Yes, so we see that kind of starting with the Greek Revival, where we have the white or the lighter trim colors, and then the sash is darker. And then that kind of continues through the 19th century styles. It gets a little bit less distinguished when you get into the Victorians, because we have a lot of kind of the muddied, deep tones, but you really kind of see that contrast in the Greek Revival, where you've got usually that bright white trim and then the black sash color.
Okay, and I think I'll do this one last question, and then I'll do my wrap up comments, and then we can continue if there are additional questions. What is this is a very common question. What's the history of painting porch ceilings a shade of blue?
So that history ties to the Gullah Geechee traditions in usually in southern states, but I know it has kind of transitioned up to into the northern as well. And so from what I understand is there was a belief that the haint blue, as they called it, was to kind of keep spirits away. There was also, I think, other times, that's the kind of the origins that I understand is coming from that culture, and that kind of connection with the spirits and keeping spirits away and protecting your house. There's also theories out there that some of the pigments used to create the blues also were kind of kept insects away, but I don't know that that's true, but it's another theory that's out there. But the one that I know for sure is that kind of connection with the Gullah Geechee community kind of in the South, that we're seeing that a lot. And then that tradition of those kind of light blue porch ceilings spreads out and is adapted elsewhere as well.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. All right, so at this point, I'm just going to do my wrap up. And for those who would like to stay on, please do so for an additional 15 minutes or so. But I want to thank Leigh for her informative presentation, highlighting traditional paint color choices as they relate to different architectural styles. If you're about to embark on a whole house paint project, we hope Leigh's talk will help guide your color choice. And if you're like me, you'll now drive around New Hampshire with a greater awareness of which houses have historically accurate color schemes and which could use a slight, or maybe more than a slight, color adjustment. Thoughtful and experienced presenters like Leigh and your great questions and involvement make a huge impact on advancing preservation interest and efforts across New Hampshire. We want you to know the Alliance is here to help and encourage you to check out our website at nhpreservation.org or send us an email at any time to bt@nhpreservation.org. Our next Expo session will be on Tuesday, July 13th at noon with May Williams and Andrew Cushing presenting House Histories, how to research the evolution of your house. They'll share tips and tricks on how to research who has lived in your historic house and how it has changed over the years. Visit nhpreservation.org for the complete Expo lineup and to register for upcoming programs. We encourage you to share the Expo website link with other old house and barn enthusiasts, and be sure to check out our Expo guide to 50 products and service providers on the Expo page of the website. For those who have been to our in-person Expo in the past, you know how we love to give away door prizes as our token of appreciation for your participation. So at this time, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Nicole Flynn, to announce the lucky winner of today's door prize. The winner will receive a field guide to American houses by Virginia Savage McAllister, a wonderful guide to America's domestic architecture, and one of the books Leigh highlighted in her talk. So Nicole, who is the lucky winner?
So the random number generator gave me Dean Van Debson.
Okay. Dean, are you still with us? Is Dean with us? No, Dean.
Know.
Oh, yeah, I think he is. Do you want to unmute yourself and say hello? You don't have to. Oh, well.
There we go. Am I on?
You are.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thanks very much. I'm looking forward to that. It was a great discussion and I've learned a lot, and we'll definitely use the book for future work on my house.
Are you about to embark on a paint project soon or not for a
I'm
while?
always embarking on a painting project with an old house.
That's true. Very true. What kind of house do you have, Dean?
I have a Federal with modifications in the Greek Revival period.
Oh, wow. So you have quite a choice of colors then, right?
Well, right now it's kind of a like an old Virginia white color because I'm kind of keeping it in tune with the Greek Revival trim.
Yeah, great. Well, enjoy the book. We will mail it to you, okay? And thanks for joining today.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so please watch for follow-up email I'll be sending out with additional resources, including how to get in touch with Leigh if you have additional questions, and a short survey that will help us plan for future programs. And please help keep the Preservation Alliance vibrant by making a donation or considering a gift membership. So thanks again to Leigh for her informative presentation, to our Old House and Barn Expo on the Road sponsors listed here on the screen, and to all of you who are supporters of our critical work that help to advance efforts to save and steward special places around New Hampshire. We wish you well and look forward to seeing you at future Alliance programs. Thanks for joining today. And for those who want to stay on, please do so. And Leigh, you can stop sharing the screen. And then if folks have additional questions, feel free to just unmute yourselves and speak up if you'd like. Here's a question that we didn't answer, Leigh. Joan writes in, I have a small red schoolhouse with lead paint. Should I continue with red or a different color? That's a tough one.
That is a tough one. And I have found that resources for houses and housing trends seem to be a lot more available, because I recently gotten questions about barn trim from the 18th century. And so I don't have a good answer for that one, but I can, I think there's still, you could follow those kind of trends for the architectural styles. We were looking at them residentially, but you could kind of follow, thinking about those pigments that were available at the time of construction, as that still applies even across different types of buildings, like a schoolhouse or kind of commercial buildings. But specifically saying what color, red was always used. That iron oxide was a common cheap color that was used, throughout the period. So it's definitely a reasonable option. But if you're looking for something else, I would kind of think about those colors that are available during the time that it was constructed, and kind of using those as a guide.
Okay, thanks, Lee. And here's another question from Michael. Maybe it was earlier and I missed it. He asked, what about Queen Anne? Aren't the rules kind of thrown out to create a painted lady?
Yes, definitely. If you're trying to doing that painted lady boutique approach, they are not following these kind of historical rules that we were talking about most of today. So they're really kind of, could be using much more than 3 or 4 colors on those houses to kind of highlight the different details. They're also picking very vibrant kind of pure colors where historically Victorian period was very muddied. And kind of those deep, rich colors. So there is a lot of Victorian houses are painted in that kind of Victoria or that painted ladies. And I don't even know, it was something that I discovered recently that was where those colors came from. So I wonder how many owners even realize that that's the history of that kind of color approach to Queen Anne. Yeah, the community I grew up in, I'm originally from Michigan, so we had a lot of Queen Anne and kind of Victorian era, and I would say most of the houses in my hometown were planted in that kind of painted ladies approach and not this kind of historical that we were talking about today.
So how do you feel about that?
It's one of those tough questions because if we're, looking at it historically, but we also are always kind of talking, I feel like that, history and preservation is not just about what was the really old. So that color movement has almost kind of become its own approach and its own, color trend to preserve in a way. So I've torn between, kind of keeping it purely historical approach and what, now if we're looking at it for another 100 years, painted ladies is going to be its own historical approach to color application as well. So it's kind of one of those, as we try and think about everybody's history and kind of our own impacts on history, I can't throw the painted lady approach totally out the window, but I think it really depends on, what your goals for the house are. With that one. So that's my kind of, I can support both ways answer there with that. So if you're trying to think strictly historical, avoiding painted ladies approach, but if you really love that kind of vibrancy, I think it has its own history now that it's part of those kind of color trends and how things have changed over the centuries.
Tactfully answered.
The
Lee,
child in me still wants that bright purple painted lady's house. So,
and the next owner can always change it if they really can't deal with it. So,
yeah.
Can you touch on, I know that there are some paint companies that have sort of interactive web functions that you can play with different paint colors.
Yeah.
Do you recommend trying that or not, or just to get a sense of color?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a great way to kind of get started thinking about it. I've played around with them plenty when I was kind of playing, when I worked with homeowners on paint colors. The only thing I would say is that because you're working on a computer screen and kind of a digital version, sometimes those subtleties between different shades really get lost in them. But if you're trying to think about kind of, a dark trim versus a light trim or those kind of bigger decisions, I think they're a great way to start. But they have their limitations. So it's definitely, can kind of help you get started with your color selection, but those kind of physical samples, I think is really, you're going to need those to make those final decisions.
Do you know do all the paint companies have those now, or?
I think so. I know Benjamin Moore and I'm pretty sure Sherwin-Williams both have those, and those are kind of the two major ones that we run into. I think there may be some other paint companies out there, but they tend to, you're looking at digital versus physical colors in them. So they're a great way to start, but not the final way I would recommend making your color selection.
Okay. Does anyone have any other questions? I have one more, but I don't want to speak over somebody else. No. All right. This is a really picky one, but whenever I paint my house, I'm always sure that I do this. I tend to paint the sides of my trim.
Yes.
Whereas most painters these days don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I think it's because when you're getting those kind of little edges with the siding, but the whole trim should be painted in that trim color.
okay. And I think
Yeah.
a lot of painters use, it just takes more time, so they
It
don't want to
does.
do that. But it gives that three-dimensionality. Otherwise, it just seems really flat to me.
Yeah, and the same thing is when you're thinking kind of, when you get to the inside of the window, when you're thinking about the sash is just the part that can move. So you want to make sure that that trim color is also kind of turning into that direction too. But you're right, yeah, it's a lot of painters, because it's just easy to kind of apply that color to that top surface, but it really should be the all three dimensions that are exposed on the trim.
Okay, great. And then one other comment I just wanted to make, because I get a lot of questions on this, is just, why is my paint peeling? And one big thing that people sometimes either don't know about or don't even consider is just the moisture content in their house. And quite often the paint failure has nothing to do with the prep or the paint. It's the moisture in your house that's pushing the paint off. So if you have a really damp basement or damp house with tons of house plants, kitchen, lots of cooking going on, showers, bathrooms, unvented dryers, you need to get the moisture in your house under control. And that will definitely help keep the paint on your clapboards.
Yeah, making sure that your kitchen and your bathrooms are properly ventilated. And those are your biggest kind of moisture sources. But yeah, sometimes it can just be the interior and not necessarily kind of a leaking gutter or something that's causing that too. So.
And then some of us who still have dirt basements need to get that under control too. So, all right. Any other questions for Leigh before we wrap up for the day? Oh, Mary has one more. Oh, no, she was just
waving goodbye.
Okay. Anybody else? No? All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining, and good luck with your paint projects, and send us photos of your new paint jobs. All right. Take care, everybody. Thank you so much, Leigh. Really appreciate it.
Of course.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.